on April 3, 1946. The strangest thing on Colonel Elias Ward's desk was not the repatriation order. It was the 4 women begging him not to obey it.
Quiet in the back.
The order from Washington was plain. 41 German female prisoners at Camp Ashton, Kansas, were to be placed on a train within 72 hours, taken east, and shipped back to occupied Germany. The war in Europe had been over for nearly 11 months. The army wanted the camp empty. The paperwork wanted the story finished. But beside that order sat 4 handwritten petitions, all written in careful English, all delivered after lights. Out the night before, 4 German women were asking to remain in America, not because they feared punishment, not because they had nowhere to go, but because each one claimed she had fallen in love with an American soldier. Colonel Ward read the first 3 letters with the same hard expression he used for court-martial files. Then he reached the 4th. It came from Anneliese Krämer, prisoner number G41720, 3 years old, former naval communications clerk from Bremen. Her handwriting was small, exact, and painfully controlled. "I know this request is improper," she had written. "I know I wore the wrong uniform. I know I should want nothing except to go home. But Sergeant Daniel Price treated me as if I had not already been judged forever. I do not ask to remain as his prisoner. I ask only for enough time to learn whether what I feel is gratitude, confusion, or something I am no longer brave enough to deny." Ward lowered the page. Across the parade yard, the women's barracks sat behind 2 lines of wire, pale in the morning fog. The camp had survived winter. The war had ended. The guards had begun packing crates, and somehow inside a place built to keep enemies apart, the one thing no regulation had imagined had happened. By 7:40 that morning, Colonel Ward had summoned Captain Ruth Marlowe, the only female officer assigned to the German women's compound. She entered with her cap under her arm and stopped before his desk before he even spoke. "You know why you're here?" Ward said. Marlowe looked at the letters. "Yes, sir." "You knew about this?" Her answer came too quickly to be rehearsed. "I knew something was changing." Ward's jaw tightened. Changing is a mild word for 4 enemy prisoners asking to postpone repatriation over romantic attachments to United States soldiers. Marlowe did not flinch. "No, sir, it is not mild, but it is also not simple." That was the part that made Ward angry, because simple was what the army depended on. Prisoner and guard, enemy and American, custody and release, order and obedience. But Camp Ashton had never been simple, not since the morning the first truckload of German women came through the gate. That had been November 19, 1944. A dry Kansas wind was cutting across the compound when 2 canvas-covered trucks rolled past the guardhouse at 9:10 in the morning. The camp had first held Italian prisoners, then a rotation of German enlisted men. By late 1944, it had been converted into a smaller branch facility for captured German female auxiliaries, clerks, telephone operators, code assistants, orderlies, and communications workers taken during the Allied drive across France and Belgium. Most of them were not frontline soldiers, but every one of them had served the German war machine. Anneliese Krämer stepped down from the second truck with a wool coat too thin for the wind and a face that refused to show pain. She had light brown hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, gray eyes, and the stiff posture of someone who had learned that emotion was a weakness other people used against you. She carried a small canvas bag. Inside were 2 shirts, a Lutheran prayer book, a cracked fountain pen, and a photograph of her older brother Matthias in a U-boat uniform. He had disappeared somewhere in the Atlantic in March of 1943. No body, no grave. Only a telegram and a mother who stopped speaking for 3 days. Sergeant Daniel Price was working intake that morning. He was 27. From a wheat farm near Enid, Oklahoma, and had been assigned to prisoner duty after a training injury left him with a limp that kept him out of the infantry. He had guarded angry men, silent men, men who spat at the ground when Americans walked by. But the women unsettled him in a different way. They looked exhausted, not harmless, not innocent, just exhausted. When Anneliese reached the table, Daniel emptied her canvas bag item by item, the prayer book, the pen, the photograph. Anneliese watched his hands touch the photo and something in her face changed. For half a second she was not a prisoner standing at inspection. She was a sister watching a stranger handle the last proof that her brother had existed. Daniel looked down at the photograph, then back at her. He placed it on top of the prayer book instead of sliding it aside with the rest of the inventory. "You can keep that," he said. She did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture. Her chin trembled once, then her face closed again. "Dank," she whispered. Daniel only nodded. That was all. No music, no destiny, no hand touching across a table. Just a soldier deciding not to be careless with a dead man's photograph. Later, Anneliese would say that was the first crack in the wall. Not because Daniel was kind, but because he was kind when nobody required it. The first month at Camp Ashton moved by rules. Roll call at 6 o'clock. Work assignments at 7:30. Kitchen duty, laundry, infirmary cleaning, filing, translation when needed. Lights out at 21 o'clock. The women lived in Barracks 4. A long wooden building with tar paper seams, thin mattresses, and a coal stove that never seemed to warm the corners. Anneliese was assigned to the records office because she could type, sort code sheets, and read enough English to be useful. Daniel was not her direct guard. Most days, he stood the afternoon gate shift and checked work details when they moved between buildings. Still, he noticed her. She walked alone even when surrounded by other women. She answered questions politely, and never added a word more than necessary. She kept her brother's photograph tucked inside her prayer book, and opened it every Sunday afternoon. By December, the prairie cold turned vicious. The wind came through the cracks in Barracks 4 like water through a sieve. On the night of December 14th, the temperature fell low enough to freeze the wash buckets inside the latrine shed. During morning roll call, Anneliese coughed into her sleeve and tried to hide it. Daniel heard. He had grown up around livestock, wheat fields, and winters that could kill a calf before breakfast. His father used to say there were 2 kinds of cruelty. The kind a man did on purpose, and the kind he permitted because it was inconvenient to stop. At noon, Daniel went to Captain Marlowe and asked whether the women could be issued extra blankets from the old Italian barrack stores. Marlowe studied him. "That a health concern, Sergeant?" "Yes, ma'am." "Or a personal one?" Daniel held her gaze. "Cole doesn't care which side they fought for, ma'am." By evening he was carrying a stack of gray wool blankets across the compound. Anneliese was sitting at a table near the stove, squinting over a copy of the Wichita Eagle with a pocket dictionary open beside it. When Daniel entered, every woman in the room stiffened. He set the blankets down. "For the cold," he said, then pointed to the stove, to the blankets, and finally to the women. Anneliese looked at the stack as if it might be a trick. Then she stood, came forward, and took one. "Thank you," she said in English. The words were careful, each one placed like a fragile cup on a shelf. Daniel smiled. Your English is good. She looked down at the newspaper. It is slow. Slow is still moving. She did not answer, but something almost like a smile passed across her face. 2 nights later, Captain Marlowe authorized short English practice sessions for the women who worked in offices. The reason on the log was practical, improved communication, fewer misunderstandings, safer camp operation. The truth was less official. Everyone was tired of speaking only through orders. The lessons began at the fence line. 3 evenings a week, under a bare bulb outside Barracks 4. Daniel stood on one side of the wire with old newspapers and a pencil. Anneliese and 2 other women stood on the other. At first, the lessons were nothing more than vocabulary. Ration, shipment, weather, breakfast, work detail. Then phrases. I do not understand. Please repeat that. I am finished. But language has a way of carrying more than grammar. By January, Anneliese knew Daniel's mother had died of pneumonia when he was 16. Daniel knew Anneliese had once wanted to become a schoolteacher. By February, she knew he could not dance because of his limp and pretended not to care. He knew she had stopped writing to friends in Germany, because too many of them still wrote as if the old slogans could save them. The conversations never lasted long. They were watched, logged, limited, but within those limits, a forbidden human thing began to grow. Not romance at first, not even friendship, exactly recognition. The dangerous relief of being seen as more than the uniform you had worn. Then April came. On April 18, 1945, Captain Marlowe made a decision that changed the women's barracks forever. Reports from liberated camps in Germany had begun reaching American newspapers. Buchenwald, Bergen, Belsen, Dachau, names that sat on the page like stones. Marlowe placed the newspapers on the barracks table that afternoon and told the women they were permitted to read them. Nobody moved at first. Then Anneliese stepped forward. She picked up the paper, and the world she had been trying to defend inside herself broke open. There were photographs, starved bodies, open pits, women with eyes too old for their faces, men who looked like they had been erased before they died. One woman in the barracks whispered, "Lies." Another began praying. A third turned away and retched into her hands. Anneliese kept reading, not because she was stronger, because she recognized too many things she had refused to understand. The Jewish family that had vanished from the apartment below hers in Bremen. The whispered jokes in the office about transports heading east. The sealed files nobody wanted to explain. The word resettlement. Spoken so often it had become a curtain over a grave. That evening, Daniel found her standing behind the laundry shed, both hands gripping the fence so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He knew he should walk past, he did not. "Anneliese," he said. She did not turn around. "You should hate me." Her English was no longer broken enough to protect her. "You should look at me and see all of it." Daniel stood on the other side of the wire. "I don't know what I should see." She laughed once without humor. "I typed orders. I handled messages. I told myself I was only a clerk, only a girl in an office, only someone who did what she was told." Her voice fell. "But every evil thing needs people who say only." Daniel had no answer for that. A weaker man might have tried to forgive her. A crueler man might have agreed with her. Daniel did neither. He simply said, "What you do after knowing matters too." Anneliese turned then. Her face was wet. "Is that what Americans believe?" "No," Daniel said. "That's what my father believed. America is still arguing with itself." For the first time, she looked at him not as guard, not as enemy, not as one decent face in a prison camp. She looked at him as if he had offered her something terrifying. a future that still required judgment, but did not end with it. VE Day arrived on May 8th. Across the compound, American soldiers shouted, laughed, sang, and slapped each other on the back. Inside Barracks 4, the German women sat in silence. Their country had surrendered. Their cities were ash. Their families were scattered. The thing they had been told was eternal had lasted 12 years, and left the world full of graves. For Anneliese, the first letter from home came on June 2nd. Her mother was alive in Bremen. Their apartment building had burned in an air raid. Her younger sister Lotte had been seen once after the surrender, pushing a handcart toward a village outside Oldenburg. Then not again. The letter ended with a sentence so simple it felt like a knife. Come back if they allow it. I cannot find your sister alone. Anneliese read that line until the ink blurred. That evening she did not come to English practice. Daniel waited until the others left, and he asked Captain Marlowe for permission to check whether prisoner G417 was ill. Marlowe stared at him for a long moment. 5 minutes, she said. And Sergeant? Yes, ma'am. Stand where everyone can see you. He found Anneliese on the barrack steps with the letter folded in her lap. She handed it through the wire without speaking. Daniel read slowly. When he finished, he folded it with more care than military paper usually received. You'll go, he said. It was not a question. Anneliese looked up. My mother needs me. Yes. My sister may be alive. Yes. And still she stopped, the space between them filled with everything they were not allowed to say. Daniel's hand lifted toward the fence, then stopped. That small, unfinished movement frightened him more than any confession could have. The next morning, Sergeant Daniel Price reported himself to Captain Marlowe. He did not name love. He did not need to. Marlowe listened in silence as he admitted that his judgment had become compromised, that he looked forward to the lessons, that he thought of Anneliese when he should not, that he no longer trusted himself to stand on the correct side of the rules. By 14 o'clock that afternoon, Colonel Ward had him in the office. Ward did not shout. You understand the problem, the colonel said. Yes, sir. She is a prisoner. Yes, sir. You are a soldier with authority in the camp that holds her. Yes, sir, then any affection between you may be real, but it cannot be free. Daniel swallowed. That sentence did what punishment could not. It made the whole thing look different. Had she chosen him, or had captivity taught her to cling to the least cruel hand near her? Had he loved her, or had he loved being needed by someone broken enough to admire ordinary decency? Ward watched the question enter his face. Good, the colonel said quietly. You are finally thinking like a man responsible for another person's freedom. Daniel was removed from all duties involving the women's compound that same day. The English lessons ended. Anneliese was told only that Sergeant Price had been reassigned, and that further personal contact was prohibited. For 9 months, they lived inside the same camp and did not speak. Not once. She saw him sometimes across the yard, carrying files, loading crates, checking truck manifests. He saw her at morning work detail. Thinner than before, her hair pinned tight, her face careful. They did not wave. They did not pass notes. Captain Marlowe made sure of that. And because there was no contact, something uncomfortable became clear. The feeling did not fade. It sharpened. It lost the warmth of daily conversation and kept the weight. By winter, the camp was shrinking. Prisoners left in groups. Barracks were emptied. Windows were boarded. The war had moved from battlefield to paperwork, from surrender to displacement, from headlines to impossible choices. made by tired clerks with stamps. Then, on March 31, 1946, the final repatriation orders arrived for the German women at Camp Ashton. The train would leave on April 6. From there, they would go east, then by ship to Bremerhaven, then into the ruins of whatever remained. Colonel Ward read the announcement in the mess hall at 10 o'clock the next morning. Some women cried, some looked relieved, some looked as if a sentence had been handed down. Anneliese stood in the second row and felt two countries pull at her at once. Germany held her mother, maybe her sister, her language, her guilt, her dead. America held a man she had not spoken to in 9 months, and the terrible possibility that she had become someone different here. That night, after lights out, 4 women stayed awake around the cold stove. Anneliese Sabine Wolf, a former hospital orderly, Martha Rees, who had worked in supply records, Clara Eber, a telephone operator whose fiancé had died outside Cassen. All 4 had formed attachments they had no right to expect would survive. All 4 knew the world would call them foolish at best and traitorous at worst. Sabine said the thing first: "If we go home, it ends." Martha shook her head. "They will write once, maybe twice." Clara stared at the stove. "My mother would say better a hungry German than an American's German wife." No one laughed. Anneliese took out a sheet of paper. Her hands were steady until she wrote the salutation. "Colonel Ward, sir." Then they began to shake. The next morning, April 3rd, the 4 petitions were on Ward's desk. By noon, the camp had become a problem no one wanted to own. Washington was notified. A legal officer was called from Fort Riley. Captain Marlowe was ordered to prepare a statement on camp conduct. The 4 soldiers named in the letters were separated from their units and questioned individually. Daniel Price gave his testimony at 1620. He did not dramatize it. He did not defend himself with poetry. He said he had developed feelings for Anneliese Krämer while assigned to camp duty. He said no physical relationship had occurred. He said he had reported himself when he realized the boundary was no longer only theoretical. Then the legal officer asked the question that mattered. "If this woman is released from custody and chooses to leave, will you interfere?" "No, sir." "If she is released from custody and chooses not to see you?" Daniel's mouth tightened. "No, sir." "If she returns to Germany?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Then I will hope she finds her sister." That answer did more for him than any declaration of love could have, because it proved, at least to the men in that room, that he did not want possession. He wanted her choice to be real. Still, the army moved slowly. The petitions were dangerous. If granted, they might encourage more requests. If denied, they might send women back before anyone had tested whether coercion had been removed. On April 5th, Colonel Ward made his decision with Washington's reluctant approval. The train would leave as planned, but the 4 petitioners would not be on it. Effective April 6th, they would be removed from prisoner work details and held under civilian displaced person review until civilian guarantors' employment and legal status could be assessed. It was not permission to marry. It was not permission to stay forever. It was a narrow bureaucratic crack in a locked door, and it tested every grand emotion in the room, because love across a fence is one thing. Love after the gate opens is another. Sabine lasted 12 days. The guard she loved was transferred to California. His letters became shorter before the month was over. She boarded a ship in May, proud enough not to cry where anyone could see. Martha found work in a bakery, but the soldier she had imagined as brave in secret turned timid in public. He would speak to her under church supervision, but not introduce her to his parents. She chose repatriation before he had to choose openly. Clara stayed longer, almost long enough. Then word came that her father had survived in a British zone hospital. She went back for him in July and never returned to America. That left Anneliese. A Mennonite widow named Mrs. Clara Hensley agreed to vouch for her in a town 20 miles from the camp. She had lost 2 nephews in the war and surprised everyone by saying that grief was no excuse to waste a living woman who knew how to type. Anneliese moved into a back room off Mrs. Hensley's kitchen. She worked mornings at a grain office, afternoons translating German letters for families trying to locate missing sons, husbands, and brothers. At night she wrote to Bremen. No answer came for 6 weeks. Daniel did not visit her at first. He had been discharged from the army on May 9th, earlier than expected, with an administrative reprimand that ended any thought of a military career. He went home to Oklahoma for harvest. Anneliese told herself this was the test. No fence, no lessons, no uniform, no authority, only distance, only silence, only the question Colonel Ward had forced both of them to face. What remained when captivity was gone? On June 18th, a letter arrived from Bremen. Her mother was alive, and Lotte, her missing sister, had been found in a village clinic, sick and underfed, but living. Anneliese sat at Mrs. Hensley's kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then she put her head down and wept with a sound so old it frightened the widow in the next room. 2 days later, Daniel Price appeared at the gate. Not in uniform, not carrying flowers, just standing there in work pants, a clean shirt, and a hat twisted in both hands. Mrs. Hensley opened the door, looked him over, and said, "You the soldier?" "Not any more, ma'am. That may help." She let him wait on the porch. When Anneliese came out, neither of them moved for several seconds. It was the first time they had stood in front of each other without wire between them. Daniel spoke first. "I heard about your sister." Anneliese nodded. "She is alive." "I'm glad. You came because of that." "I came because I promised myself I would not come until your choice could cost you nothing I controlled." The line was awkward, too formal, exactly like him. Anneliese smiled through tears. "And now," Daniel looked toward the wheat fields beyond the road, "now I can tell you the truth without being your guard." He turned back. "I love you. I loved you when I should have walked away sooner. I loved you when I stayed away because staying away was the only honest thing I could do. And if you want Germany, I will not ask you to stay. If you want your family, I will help you get home, if there is any way I can." Anneliese stepped down from the porch. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And if I want both?" Daniel's face changed. Not triumph, not relief, something more careful. "Then we find out what both costs." They married on September 7th, 1946, in a small church with more empty pews than guests. Daniel's father came and sat in the back. He did not smile during the vows, but after the ceremony, he shook Anneliese's hand and said, "My son says you can read weather maps," she said. "A little." He nodded. "Then you may be useful." It was the closest thing to welcome he had in him that day. Over time, there would be more. Not quickly, not cleanly. People stared at the market. Someone painted the word Kraut on Daniel's barn door that first winter. A woman at church moved her child away from Anneliese during service. Anneliese sent half her wages to Bremen until her mother and sister had enough ration cards and coal to survive the cold months. In 1948, Lotte wrote that she had taken a job in a school kitchen. In 1949, Anneliese became an American resident. In 1951, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Ruth, after the captain who had protected both discipline and mercy at Camp Ashton. Years later, when people asked how a German prisoner could marry an American guard, Anneliese always corrected them. "I did not marry my guard," she would say. "I married the man who stopped being my guard before he asked for my heart." That distinction mattered. It was the whole story, because the petitions at Camp Ashton were not proof that love cancels history. They did not erase the uniform Anneliese had worn. They did not erase the camps she had learned about too late. They did not erase the mother she nearly abandoned, or the sister she feared she would never find, or the country she had to answer for in the mirror. What those letters proved was smaller and harder. They proved that even inside a system built on categories, a person could become impossible to keep in one enemy. Prisoner, guard, victim, witness, wife, citizen. None of the words were false. None of them were complete. On the last page of her old prayer book, Anneliese kept a copy of the petition she had written on April 2nd, 1946. Not because it was romantic, because it reminded her of the first time she asked the world for a choice that belonged to her. And beneath it, in Daniel's plain handwriting, was one sentence he added years later: "The fence was real. So was what crossed it."